Thank you, gentlemen. This has been very, very helpful. Let's talk about Russia and NATO. When Russia invaded Georgia, about all we could do was talk about it and denounce it. When Russia took the action that they took in Crimea, a treaty ally of ours, whose border we had promised to defend if they gave up nuclear weapons, military action was clearly off the table. Presumably, Russian action in Transnistria would not call for military action by the United States. But Dr. Brzezinski, you draw a line when it comes to the Baltic states, and I certainly I want to agree with you there. Let me ask you this: could you explain a little more your idea about working with NATO on tripwires in the Baltic states? General Snowcroft, what do you think about that idea as you understand it having been described? And what can we do to get our NATO allies to take national defense and Western defense responsibilities seriously? We ask them to spend a mere 2% of their GDP on the military, and frankly, it's only 2 or 3 of those NATO allies that actually do that. So if you'd comment on those, and Dr. Brzezinski, you can begin.
Well, first of all, on your last question, I think we should address that in NATO, and perhaps some device, some procedure could be formulated whereby NATO members which fail to meet that 2% standard lose some of their sort of entitlement to participate in key decisions. I don't know precisely how to work that out, but it seems to me if you don't pay, you don't decide. That at least might make them a little more conscious of the fact that collective obligations should be treated seriously. Insofar as the guarantee itself to the Baltic countries, what I said earlier, I'll simply repeat, I think the Russians really don't know how active we would be in saving them if for one reason or another the leader of the Russian Federation decided that he can get away with a seizing, with a quick action, which altogether alters the situation which he finds so abhorrent, namely the creation of independent states, or the recreation of independent states in the place that the Soviet Union occupied in the late 30s and early 40s. If you were to do that, we would be faced with a horrible situation, because we don't have the means to stage an amphibious warfare that results in the landing of our forces and then a gradual ground war, presumably on the territory of the Baltic states, and their expulsion. So the only sensible step that we can now take, I think, is to preposition some tripwire-type forces, forcing Putin to consider seriously whether he's prepared to go into a major conflict with us. And if he does that, then we have no choice to respond, not only in the Baltic republics, but perhaps elsewhere. For example, impose a worldwide embargo on any movement of Soviet ships, Soviet airplanes, other actions of military type, which would be a response designed to impose further costs, and including perhaps some occasional military engagements chosen elsewhere if we couldn't do something directly in the Baltic Republic.
If we wouldn't defend our NATO allies in the Baltics, I don't know what our word would be worth. General Snowcroft, what do you think about this topic?
Well, first, I think that we don't want to recreate the Cold War, and I don't think it's necessary. I think if we want to do something, tripwires, NATO is the tripwire to me, and I think if we want to tell them what we will do if they do certain things, then they better not. I don't have a problem with that, but I I can see Putin just trying to provoke us to spend more efforts. And I'm not sure it's necessary. I believe the contribution of some of the Europeans to NATO is deplorable. And I think the fact is, there are two facts. First of all, they don't feel threatened. And secondly, they're basically exhausted after 2 wars. And they're just happy to leave everything up to us, including paying for it. There, I think we ought to give it some thought. But my sense is we would get greater European support if we had ideas about how to use NATO usefully, now that, to me, the threat of a march of Russian troops into Western Europe is not a reasonable thing to happen.
Let me just ask you briefly, if the chair will indulge. Do you have any comments for this committee about the adequacy of our naval fleet at the present time? The chair in his opening remarks talked about the size of our military being roughly equivalent to what it was after World War I. Do we have enough ships? Are we building enough ships? Is our fleet adequate to protect national interests? Dr. Brzezinski?
I have not looked into that specifically, so I cannot give you a straightforward answer.
I don't think either one of us has examined that kind of question, or simply don't have an answer to that.
Thank you very much.
As we look at Putin, what do you think his end game is in Ukraine?
My own estimate is to reverse what has transpired a year or so ago, namely the decision by the Ukrainian people to associate themselves and their longer-range identity with the West. I think he views that as a major intrusion on historically significant component of the larger Russian Empire. I think he has this kind of general concept of imperial restoration as guiding him. If you look at some of the things he has done to define the presidency, the symbolism associated with it, and so forth, it has a lot of imperial trappings. And he's prepared to use force to make that happen. Our position has been that we have no desire to intrude into Russian sort of security aspirations, but that the nation has a right to define itself voluntarily. And that's a very complicated issue. And as a consequence, we now have this very serious problem between us and the Russians regarding the future of Ukraine. And he's clearly striving to destabilize Ukraine, not risking an all-out invasion, but to destabilize it from within.
If he takes similar action in Latvia, you know, his little green men and all of those things in going into Latvian territory, and NATO does not respond, is that in effect the end of NATO?
I would say so, because NATO is meant to be a collective alliance. And if the United States doesn't respond, that certainly would be the result. Now, conceivably, we could let him do it, let him take Latvia or Estonia, and then we would mobilize NATO to counter this somehow, either on the spot or on a larger world front. But that would be a much more risky enterprise than doing what I advocate, which is simply to create a tripwire within Latvia and Estonia, which communicates clearly to Russia that NATO will be involved, that the United States particularly is present, and therefore the risks you are taking are much, much higher than you might calculate in the light of the ease of the operation in seizing Crimea.
Dr. Snowcroft, I'll end with it. Would you also see that as that's the end of NATO?
Oh, well, certainly it would be the end of NATO if the Soviet Union moved into a NATO member and we did nothing. Absolutely it would. But I don't see that happening. I don't see Putin's a nasty piece of work. Probably shouldn't have said that. But I don't think he is evil incarnate. And I think if we tell him quite clearly what we won't stand for in terms of NATO members especially, there won't be such an action.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And the best way to tell him is to do something to make him think about it.